What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here. Ellen is not used to my engaging personality and overwhelming excitement when I get to host. The last time her and I were together was on a shale sort of webinar, learning, teaching, that basically it was just really uplifting, right? So, but nonetheless, I am so excited because I'm a big fanboy, and I have Ellen Wald, who is, among other things, author of literally a phenomenal book called Saudi Inc. So we have so much to chat about. But first, Ellen, welcome to the show. How are you, other than the jammed finger from the medicine ball incident?
Thanks. I'm great, actually. It's a good week, so can't complain.
Well, I don't know. I mean, how many people will tell you this, but I woke up to you this morning because now that I'm banned on LinkedIn, Twitter has become my new thing. And your post from the Forbes article today on Biden's position of fracking was the top thing in my feed. I know. It was like
Wow.
it's almost like social media is connected to my calendar, knew that I was going to be interviewing you today, and then fed me your article in Forbes where you were writing about Biden's on again, off again, confusing fracking picture. And I want to set the record straight, at least in your opinion. What is Biden's position on fracking should he become president of the United States?
Biden's position on fracking is whatever works for him. I think I think he as a person has no opinion on fracking other than what would be best for him politically or for in terms of the party. I think he's actually in a really tough position, and same with Kamala. And I wrote about this on Forbes also after the vice presidential debate, where she basically completely dodged the fracking question. I mean, it was
Mm-hmm.
put very, very straightly to her, and she basically just completely dodged it. And I actually wrote that it wasn't a bad move for her because she wasn't going to be able to win either way. She was either going to piss off the progressives, of which she is absolutely one, who want people to come out and say, yes, we're going to ban fracking, we're going to end fossil fuel use. And then the moderate wing, which says, hold on, like, we need low energy prices, we can't function without fossil fuels at this point, let's be more pragmatic. And she just dodged the question, which was the best thing she could have done. Biden, on the other hand, doesn't dodge the question. He just makes completely contradictory statements all the time. Like, we're not going to ban fracking. I am absolutely going to ban fracking. Well, we're only going to end it new fracking on federal lands. Well, we're absolutely going to phase out fossil fuels. Well, you're talking about phasing out fossil fuels in 70 years? Okay. People could buy that. You're talking about phasing them out in the next 4 years in a Biden administration. You're not going to get a lot of people getting behind that.
So it's very interesting because so the state of politics today, obviously, I mean, social media is everywhere, right? Even if you just have a random rally, someone films you, posts it. If you're catering to a base, everything you say is there forever. And so, on the one hand, some of the pushback that I've got from people on Twitter is, well, Biden doesn't really mean it. So, we have to hope and there's a lot of voters are being asked to speculate what they may or may not do. And I have friends who are in the oil and gas industry who are like, well, I don't like Trump. And I know that Biden might be bad for energy, but he probably won't be bad for energy. So I'm going to vote for Biden anyway. And I'm wearing my Hope Is Not a Plan t-shirt today because, I mean, it seems to me that the Democratic Party really wants to push for the Green New Deal and stimulus spending to be specifically spent on wind and solar and renewables at the expense of fossil fuels, regardless of his explicit position on fracking. I'm curious, do you agree with that stance?
I absolutely do, and I think that that people who are saying, "Well, I don't think Biden would do X," are probably right. But I think the real issue is Biden going to actually be? Would he actually be running the show, and who actually be running his environmental policy? Because I think he'll sign off on whatever his team comes up with. And so if he's got, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and, the architects of the Green New Deal running energy policy, then Biden is absolutely for banning fracking. And so, and that's a question that really you have to ask it when you're looking at a candidate who's so old, who is clearly not totally with it. I mean, if you watch older videos of Biden and you watch the videos of him now, I mean, there is definitely a mental acuity loss, and you can see it. It is obvious.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound mean because like he's not a young guy, and this happens to people. We get older, we forget stuff. I mean, I see it in myself, and I'm still young as we measure these things. So you can't fault him, but you have to, when you're looking at him as a candidate, you have to say, well, who's really going to be running the show? And I don't think that it's going to be him.
I agree. And I think while we're on that topic, I wrote a post in January of 19 about retirement ages, and that I can't remember the exact stat. Someone will have to fact check my own writing because it's been 18 months and I'm getting older, so I can't remember all the stats. But there was something like 41 or 50% of S&P 500 companies have a mandatory retirement age on their board, and that the median age is something like 72. I'll post a link to it in the show notes so people can confirm. But it's amazing that like businesses know that mental acuity drops, and yet like some of our justices are over 75, or at least were. The people running for president, at least, going into their second term, Trump will be over 75. Biden is over 75. Nancy Pelosi, although she does look amazing for like however old she is. I think she's like 78, and maybe Schumer's
she's 80.
Is she 80? I mean, if I look like that at 80, like she does look. I don't love her. I don't even like her, but she looks good for an 80-year-old. But like, shouldn't they be retired and like going on cruises and catching the coronavirus or something? Like, what are they doing still working at this point? What do you think about a retirement age for politicians?
Oh, I think that it's absolutely something that should be considered. I really don't like putting a lot of like rules and regulations other than term limits, which I think are good because, I
Love
think
term limits.
so term limits, I think like the idea that someone can just keep getting reelected for 20, 30 years, that's a serious threat, I think, to our country and to our democracy, and in general, sometimes you vote in these things, you're like, oh, judge, do you want to like reaffirm that this judge? So anyone who's been there before, like if I don't know anything, sometimes I'll just say, you know what, the time for someone new, just because you need turnover. And so I think that we really do need to consider the age of people. Now, there's something to be said for experience and wisdom, and like I've interviewed a lot of older people. Especially I did for my book. I interviewed a lot of older men, some of whom were in their 80s, about their youth and their experiences. And these things were very valuable, but that doesn't mean that they should be at the forefront of policy making. So, there's a use for, I think, the wisdom and knowledge gained through age, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be the ones having to, respond to things and be in the thick of negotiations. Now, that being said, does Nancy Pelosi really work all that much? I mean, we don't really know how much these people actually, how much time do they actually spend working, and how much is done by their staffs, and they just like, prop them up in front of the TV camera occasionally and say, okay, speak.
Right. I mean, it is a great question, and I truly hope that coming out of this, because I remember going into the 2016 election, and I had a strong opinion that neither candidate was good. And I remember definitively standing in line to vote. And I was like, has anyone new declared that they're running that I could vote for today? To that. But I don't remember the nervousness around like, oh my goodness, what happens if my candidate, and it goes on both sides, doesn't win? I really hope that politics at some point comes back to, I don't know, where, I mean, it should matter, but it's the staff that ultimately run things. But it seems like our two policies on both sides of parties are so different. Do you have any hope that in 2024 or 2022 we'll like have a come to Jesus with ourselves and say like, let's stop putting 75-plus-year-old white men and 80-year-old like leaders in all the positions, and let's like have a changing of the guard?
It's interesting because I was really like interested in the Democratic. I'm not registered with any political party, so in Florida, you can't, if you're not a member of a political party can't vote in the primary. So I didn't vote, but I was very interested in following what was going on with the Democratic primaries, because I was like, wow, they have a real opportunity here because the Clintons are gone, the Obamas are gone. Like, let's see where, like, who have they got? Who are who are the rock stars here? Who are the young people? And it was like, is there there was like no one there, and I was like kind of disappointed. I was like looking to see like what's going on here, and it was just like very unimpressive people. And early on, I really did think that Kamala was going to be the nominee. I was very surprised that she dropped out. I know, I could see what happened. She just wasn't a
She
good
wasn't that
candidate.
impressive.
She wasn't impressive. I just assumed they were going to go with her simply because of she's a woman.
The woman race state thing. Yeah. The reason they went with her for VP, you mean?
Right, except that she's still got a lot of the same issues that she had. She's not inspiring. She turns people off. She laughs about everything, which I think makes people feel upset because they feel like she's not taking things seriously, whether that's why she laughs or not. But it's interesting because when I first started, going on TV and doing media stuff, the first piece of advice I got was, whatever you do, don't laugh. Don't do that nervous laugh. And it's a thing that a lot of women do, and it makes you seem unserious. And as soon as like someone said that to me and I noticed myself doing it, I started to really like stop myself from doing it. And I just want to like and say that to her. It just comes across as unserious and not taking it seriously when I don't know why she does it, but to me it's a huge turnoff.
The other thing that, like, again, and I am not registered with either party. I think people know that I lean right for sure fiscally, although the party that used to be right of me is now somehow left of me. I'm not sure how that happened. But so I too watched the Democratic convention with interest. And if I'm honest, I thought the two most impressive candidates, if we were truly a merit-based political system where we're trying to get new ideas and fresh people who inspire thinking, I thought Andrew Yang was pretty impressive. But the one I would have picked for VP is Pete Buttigieg. Like,
really, I was so turned off by him.
Oh, see, I love that. Why was that? I mean, I think because, again, I mean, like, let's be clear, and this is not a race or gender bias thing, but clearly the Democrats picked the black woman, and there were two, her or Stacey Abrams. Those were the two choices that they were going to go with. That doesn't feel like merit to me. So if you're going to go with like trying to break barriers, the gay mayor from Indiana, who's an ex-military veteran, well-spoken, seemed like a good choice. But you weren't inspired by him. That's great. Tell me about this.
Yeah. To me, he came across as a guy who like has always been planning his run for president, and so everything about his career was curated as such, down to like even the stint at McKinsey. And so I just saw him as another one of these like kind of the guys who's been like just like who wrote the guy who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. As soon as I saw, I was like, that guy wants to run for president. I was like, I bet he runs for governor of Ohio, and then he's going to run for president. Because it's like they're preparing for it, and that bothers me. See, I like Tulsi Gabbard. I thought she was really willing to tell it like it is, and stood firm in her beliefs.
So you know what? I also didn't mind Tulsi. She is Hawaii, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And so, and again, and I do get, especially in an election year like this, I don't know why they would have picked a California where you're as blue as you could possibly be when you need help in Pennsylvania or Michigan or wherever. And I know we're not talking about politics, but I do find, but it's so important in the context of everything, in the same way that coronavirus was and is. You were in Florida, and I remember we were talking about this on the last thing. And I have lots of friends who've just come back from Florida, and the vibe in Florida is very different. And it seems to be attracting a lot of visitors because people are like, I'm over my state, I want to go hang out in Florida. And then also, it seems like a lot of people from New York, hedge funds, etc., are deeply considering the zero tax move down there. What's your perspective of the virus being there? And then also, comparing the media, because you're very well connected with all that. Like, what's going on with Florida?
So So first of all, I live in North Florida, which is like a totally different state from South Florida. So to give you some, like North Florida is like basically like South Georgia, people
Okay.
say.
Okay.
So I mean, I wouldn't say we're quite like Panhandle, I mean, because I'm right on the Atlantic coast in Jacksonville, but so not like Panhandle. Panhandle is more like Mississippi, Alabama. Like it's different. I don't know how to explain. Like Panhandle, Florida is different from this part of North Florida, but it's like, I mean, we're a big city, and it's very. I mean, things are like very tense. I mean, I would say in general, like we're also a Navy town. We have two naval air bases around here, so a lot of the population is somehow affiliated with the military. But and generally, like it's a very Republican area, although we've had a Democratic mayor. In fact, I was once at like a community kind of group thing, and he came to talk, and everyone was like, "Why aren't you running as a Republican?" Like he said everything like that this mostly Republican leaning group was interested in, and so now we have a Republican mayor, and I don't really like him. I think a lot of people don't like him at all. So it's a little bit odd here, but it's, I mean, there's a lot of enthusiasm for Trump. Not to say there isn't enthusiasm for Biden. Like the sign game in my neighborhood has gotten really strong. But it's also a very, very like fast growing area. Like you talk about hedge funds moving down to Miami and, Palm Beach and stuff like that. Obviously that's where they're going to want to go. The airport situation is better if you want to travel to New York and stuff. But St. Johns County, which is right next to where I live, is just exploding. I mean, the amount of just building and growth there is insane. And I'm sure it's due to the fact that we've got no state income tax, low property taxes. There's also something called homesteading, where the first home and that you buy can basically you lock in your property tax rate. So, and our property taxes are low compared to, I mean, I've looked at moving to other places and it's like,
Right.
like
Well, I
how
mean,
do you, like,
Texas is a great example of no state tax, but like if you're not working, if you're a retiree paying 35, 40, $45,000 a year on property tax, you can't run that very long. So it's
yeah,
not Texas is a great place to work and live. I think Florida is a great place to retire and live for that
oh,
reason.
yeah, the property tax thing is huge. And especially if you're in the military or you have been in the military or you're a military spouse, there are a lot of breaks you can get on property taxes. Utilities are a little bit higher then I think because the property taxes are so low, the utilities tend to be a little higher. But in general, it's like, I mean, yeah, you need your air conditioning, but at least here we can get cold in the winter. I mean, it can freeze here, but it's general like there's only like 2 months out of the year.
And would you say that people, in terms of their views of coronavirus, the national media would certainly say everyone in Florida is being very glib about it. Is that your take
Um,
on it?
I don't think so. I think that I mean, I think that, there are a lot of people who take it very, very seriously, and then there are a lot of people who just, I think, go along with what everyone else is doing. You don't really know what they feel in private unless you can talk to them and you feel comfortable talking to them. The city that I live in had a mask mandate that is apparently supposed to expire tonight, which
Interesting.
it was supposed to expire in September, but they renewed it. I don't think they're gonna renew it, but I'm not totally sure about that. But it's supposed to expire. In general, though, I say like I think unless you like go into like Costco or Trader Joe's, which are really kind of militant, like no one will ever give you a problem. Like there'll be a sign that says "Wear a mask." There'll be people in the front standing there with like bottles of hand sanitizer, and you can walk right into a store without wearing a mask, and they will smile and greet you and never say a word.
Right.
So it's more like we want you to do this. Please follow the rules. We're not going to give you any problems. Like, and I've never seen anybody ever harassed by another person or an employee or anything for not wearing a mask. People do not wear masks outside. It's also hot and muggy still. Like
Right.
I mean, so I think, I think people take it seriously in the fact that like there's a lot of messaging about it, but people go out to eat in restaurants. We're now at full occupancy. I'm not sure that restaurants generally have been full occupancy, but like they're there are people
There's no restrictions that govern what it is. People are
not
making their own
anymore.
choice. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people who are going out. I mean, I went out to eat on Sunday, and it wasn't packed, but there were a good number of people in there. Like I would say a normal number of people for like a Sunday night after a football game.
So I don't know how this would work, but before we pivot to your book, because we have a lot to talk about with Saudi Arabia, but do you think the country is too big to govern? And I just think about the local differences, and I have this meme in my. I don't know how to make memes because I'm too old, but if I could make a meme, it would basically be like a little blue guy who live in New York and California who are running away from the state because their taxes are going high, and they're going to Arizona and Colorado, two places I love, and one of which I live in and one of which I own in, and then Florida. But then all the red people start like each inching their way to the border, and then they flee, and you basically have this mass migration where ultimately Republicans are going to end up living in New York when they drop the taxes and try and bring back productive people, and all the Democrats who've just trashed states with policies and voting in Proposition 50 billion are now in the states that used to be so good, and now they don't understand why everyone's leaving in and that's the meme I have running around in my head. So
Oh, totally.
is the country too big to govern?
Well, I think that there's a point to our federalist system, and that's that people, it's very community based, and what works for Manhattan or whatever is not what's going to work for Florida or South Dakota or Colorado or Wyoming. I mean, if I could live anywhere right now, I'd probably live in Wyoming. I would probably live in Laramie, Wyoming, which is like one of my favorite places on earth. Um, like if I had lived I probably have decamped for Wyoming a while ago. But even, and you asked me about, who do I think could come out in 2024. And I think that, Governor Kristi Noem is clearly gotten a national spotlight. And there are a lot of people out there who really see South Dakota as a model for, how they dealt with these challenges in a way that was right for their state. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see a lot of growth heading to that statement. If you look at the economies of, I know they're like red states versus blue states. I don't think it's red state versus blue state. I think it should be more in terms of how different states dealt with the economic lockdowns. And Florida had an extremely brief one, and the Florida economy compared to other economies is much, much, much better. And so I think South Dakota you'll see is the same. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see people like, if I would consider moving there if I didn't like the way Florida was going. And, there are a lot of reasons to go there. And I think people will just try. I wouldn't be surprised in a country where it's not that hard to pick up and move, especially now with all this work from home business. You don't like that your kids aren't in school. You don't like that you can't go out to eat. Well, you're going to move to a state where you can, a state maybe like South Dakota or or Florida or whatnot. And there's also more to Florida than just Miami. I get it, and Tampa. There's a lot of very nice places out there that are less populous, basically.
So let's pivot a little. You're a very bright cookie, and the first time I came across you, actually, it was very fortuitous. I was on Bloomberg, and we were talking about the Saudi Aramco IPO, and a secret little story that I have never shared before. But I was chatting with Alex, and we've been talking about larger shale issues because clearly I'm a U.S. shale guy. And Alex Steele, brilliant, really great at what she does. And she said, well, hey, if you're in New York, why don't you come on? And I was like, well, cool. I think I'm going to be there like first week in November. She's like, well, what do you know about Saudi Aramco? And I was like, nothing right. I didn't say this, but in my head, I go, nothing right now, but they have a 656-page IPO, and I can read it. So by the end of 3 days, I had read the entire IPO.
Wow. I don't even think I read the entire IPO.
And I learned so many fascinating things so that when I went on for my 3 minutes, which is, you literally prepare for all these questions, and then the questions they ask are really interesting, but you have literally 45 seconds. And so the reason I bring that up is because they were asking you your view from the day before, and they showed a tape of what you had said as the lead in to me and my friend that became my friend then, Mark Rossano. who was also on with me at the same time, and he and I ended up, not surprisingly, talking for like an hour and a half by the free coffee they have in the Bloomberg thing, which
Oh
was
my God.
awesome.
That's
Is
the
that
thing.
the best?
I think that's one of the things I miss the most about not
In
like
person? Oh,
traveling
yeah.
and going to like it's like the Bloomberg office, like all the snacks. I'll like go, the free coffee, the coffee bar. I'll like snag, like a whole bunch of granola bars for later and stuff. Oh,
Oh, it's the
it's
best. It's the
great.
best. And so then I meet Mark, who's like an extreme guy. I've had him on the podcast a couple of times, but he's so smart. And at the time, it was November 2019, and he's like, "Man, there's so much oil. I'm so bearish." And I was bullish oil because I was like, "Well, U.S. shale is going to decline, so the world's going to be." And he's talking about tankers and moving, and I was like, "Wow, that was fascinating." And that night was the night that I ended up at a Vicky Hollub, the Financial Times, sort of like with the CEO.
Wow.
And so it's like a really good day for me. I threw in a massage envy on the walk between A and B, and then Vicky was standing at the front, and people always ask, like, how did I get to know Vicky? Well, she was standing alone getting ready to speak, and I went straight up to her, and I was like, you don't know me, but I want you to know I'm a huge fan. And I do this little thing called Hot Take of the Day. There's no reason you would have ever heard of me. And she's like, no, I've heard of you. And so, and so I was like, oh, now I even love her more. But I will. The reason I tell that story is you teed it up. So I followed what you wrote. And then after we were on the seminar, because you actually know a lot more than I do about Saudi Aramco, I just read the IPO. You wrote Saudi Inc., which I'm going to tell you, I mean this like this is a phenomenal read. Like it's true. It's like, because what I love about it is you've done it in a story way that even though it's like real characters, the character development of the kings and how they're dealing with their brothers and how they're negotiating, and then like the one of the ones that I wanted to start here was in 1973 with the embargo, that they were negotiating the price from like $3 a barrel, and the Saudis maybe wanted to push it to $6, and they had OPEC, and then they were going to embargo the U.S. to like show their pricing power, and ultimately oil traded up to $15 a barrel. And I think so many people forgot about how influential that moment in geopolitics and political time of taking the U.S. influence out of Saudi Aramco ultimately, and then the OPEC putting its grip on the world economy, which was so taken with oil. I wanted you to talk about that as a start.
Yeah, I love that, and that chapter drove me a little bit crazy because there was so much going into it, but it 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 took me a while, I think, to really understand what was going on in this embargo play, because there's been so much assumption and I think almost like misinformation. And finally, I think I figured out where it comes from. And it's this idea that, the Saudis hated Israel, therefore they wanted to embargo the allies of Israel, and the United States was supplying weapons to Israel and this, that, and the other thing. And everything I have learned about Saudi Arabia, this goes all the way back to when I was an undergraduate writing my, undergraduate thesis, and I came across this document. It was like within 1948, the Americans write to the ambassador in Saudi Arabia. They're like, we think this Israel thing is like probably going to happen. They're going to declare a state. Like, what's Saudi Arabia going to do? And the ambassador's like, he talks to the king, and the king essentially says to him, "We don't really care if the Jews declare independence as long as they don't try to expand their territory into Saudi Arabia." And as long as and by the way, America, you're going to keep developing and selling our oil and making us money, right? Like, and I was like, that's all they really care about is money. They don't really care about this Israel thing. And I was like, well, so how does that play out in this story? Because it doesn't really fit this narrative of it was all about Israel. And when I looked into it more, in more detail, and I found out that it coincided exactly with this OPEC push to raise prices, and that it was essentially, and you're dealing with a lot of different players here. You're dealing with the Saudis, you're dealing with the Iranians, you're dealing with the Iraqis, the Kuwaitis, and the Saudis are basically the Saudis and the Iranians are the most important players at this point. And so it's Zaki Amani and Shamsia Muzagar who are doing the negotiations for OPEC with these companies. And that's how it used to work, because the oil producing countries, whether or not they controlled their oil, they were basically just selling all their oil to the big companies who had the marketing outlets to sell it everywhere else. So they would negotiate a price. And it's, the 70s, and the Saudis realize that they finally have the upper hand in terms of the United States, because the United States can no longer increase its oil production to accommodate growing demand. They have to now import. And that gives them a power that they didn't have in 1967, for example. And they know that. But Zaki Yamani and also the King of Saudi Arabia at the time were very concerned. They always were looking out for the long term, the bigger picture. And they knew that they needed to have a price of oil that was good for them, but that wasn't too high, because if you go too high, then demand starts to drop off. And they were really concerned about this, particularly in the long run. And that's why Yamani was like, we want to, double the price, which would have risen it from like, $2 to like $4. I mean, it seems like crazy
It's
to us now,
crazy.
like $4.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
And these companies were like, well, we really can't do that. We have to go and talk to our governments, and they're negotiating. Finally, the Saudis are like, look, yes or no. Like, we're not going to just keep doing this. Like, yes or no, give us your answer. And they're like, we can't. We just can't. We got to go back to talk to the governments of these countries. And they're like, fine, negotiations are over. And there's this scene where they actually end up in the hotel room late at night. The two guys who are doing the negotiations for the American and British companies end up in the hotel room of Saki Yamani. I think he was staying at the Intercontinental in Vienna. And he's like trying to like stave the monster. He like peels an apple, or he orders a Coke. He squeezes the lime, and finally calls the Kuwaiti oil minister, who comes into his room in his pajamas, and they're like talking. So finally he's like, and they're like, and the oil company guys are like, well, what's going to happen? And Yamani is like, listen to the radio tomorrow. And that's when they went to their Arab OPEC meeting. I think it was in Baghdad or Kuwait, I can't remember which one, and they announced this embargo. And I read that and I was like, you know what? They kept saying, we're not going to do this, and then they did it. Why did they do it? They did it because it was a convenient cover for basically economic warfare. They were like, we have the power to raise the price unilaterally, but that looks like basically like economic warfare. So they use this, at least for the Saudis, it's an excuse. This embargo is an excuse as a way to raise the oil price. And then it went up too high. And
it went to 15 to 18.
Yeah.
And that was what caused all the panic in the US and the rationing, and then
the biggest question. Okay, so Yamani says we're doing this embargo. Well, you got to ask, okay, but Americans are running the oil industry. So you're going to say to the CEO of an American oil company, Aramco, you are not allowed to sell oil to America. You're not allowed to ship it, literally ship it. Now, and so the guy who's the head of Aramco at that time, he basically is like, well, how is this going to work? And Yamani says, you're going to do it. And here's the interesting thing. He just did it. And that's what like astounded me. I was like, why did he just do it? All in other parts of this relationship, Aramco always pushed back on what the Saudis did. They were like, well, we can't really do this. This isn't a really good idea. You might want to think about this. We don't know. He just like went and did it. And he did it so well, he like overcompensated. And his name was Frank Jungers. And so he's actually, I believe he's still alive. So I called him up and I got an interview with him and I asked him about it. And he continues to give the same answer, which was that like that's what the king wanted. And right. That's what he did. But the truth is that he never pushed back. And so and there was there was a lot of like shady stuff going on with this guy. In fact, I talked to a guy, Tim Barger, who is the son of a former CEO, who has since passed away. Actually, he passed away before.
No, do I remember right? His son also worked there too, right?
Yeah.
He played a pretty prominent role in the first half of the book.
Tom Barger, that's the father.
Barger.
So I talked to his son, who grew up in a funny story. Tim's sister is actually a fairly prominent, I think, hedge fund owner, and who they invest in a lot of oil stuff. She was profiled in the Wall Street Journal at one point. I just recognized the last name, and also because of his stories, he tells a story about her dog in Saudi Arabia. But so he said that actually Jungers then gets fired shortly thereafter, and he said that they say that he was fired because he, did this embargo thing, but really he was involved in some like really shady malfeasance business, and they fired him for that. But so it's kind of interesting that I mean, I would really like, if you want to know who to blame for this, I would blame Jungers because he never pushed back.
Well, and so what I found, I found a lot, and so fact is stranger than fiction, number one. And the way that you talk about the story, and I hope listeners can appreciate, like, the book is written as though it could be fictional, but you know it's real. And so you kind of get to know the characters, and you see the challenges in the family. And I can't remember, it was in the 60s when the two sons took over, and the one guy was running it and the other guy was sort of not, and like he kind of like deposed his brother, but he couldn't fight with him. I mean, there's just so much interesting stuff in the book. But the thing that I found really interesting was the overlay to that was the Saudis were producing so much oil that they thought that they were going to have to start water flooding, and that ultimately the oil price didn't support that. And so if you had a view that you could get 3 versus 6, and obviously we didn't know where the world would go, I mean, I wouldn't blame Jungers, because they probably all were saying, well, oil's 3. If oil were 15, our companies are 5 times more valuable. My stock is 5 times more valuable. And the only way I can create this problem is through a geopolitical machination. And the Saudis actually wanted to shut down production because they had some challenges with the reservoirs. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. And this actually didn't come out until there were Senate hearings on it, Senate and House hearings on this issue. And it didn't come out until then. And they brought this guy in. They got a petroleum engineer from Aramco to come, and maybe not from Aramco, from I think SoCal, which was one of Aramco's parent companies, to come and talk about this. And he says that there were actually serious issues that the Saudis were not Saudi, sorry, that Aramco was overproducing its fields. And they were going to need to start doing this water flooding. And so they needed both to restrict production, both for the health of the fields at that point, but also in order to do all of this work that would then enable them to get the pressure up. And so it was a very fortuitous time to have this, these production cuts, basically, or to have this embargo. And I don't even know so much that the Saudis engineered this geopolitical event, because this was something that a lot of Egypt and these other Arab countries have been pushing for. They've been pushing for OPEC to do an embargo. They pushed for it in 1967 when OPEC had no power. So they've been pushing for it for a while, and it happened to coincide. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War happened to coincide very well with these negotiations. And so I think they latched onto it as a cover for a move that they had to do. And you can see, because later, in December, when they go to sit down and OPEC goes to negotiate a price, they're negotiating now with each other. Forget the oil companies. They don't get a say now. This is just OPEC within itself. And they're negotiating. They're like, okay, we got to actually set the price. We can't just let it be what the market wants, because that's crazy. And the Saudis are pushing for lower prices. And the Iranians are like, no, we want the highest price. And in the end, the Saudis got them down a little, but they, it was still too high. The king didn't want that high. They couldn't reach the king. They managed to reach the crown prince, who was basically like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Kind of just okayed it. And then the Iranians went and announced it on TV. And the Saudis were not happy about that. And so it ended up being a bit higher than the Saudis wanted, but not nearly as high as the Iranians had wanted. And that's basically that's basically what OPEC then became.
Well, and never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And
Never.
I think, and I again, we're going to talk about 2020 and the Russians and the Saudis, because obviously there's a tie. But again, you might not have created a crisis, but once a crisis presents itself, it's sort of like it's a little bit different, but I've learned from horror movies, if someone breaks into your house and you stab them, they're going to come back and get you unless you get them when they're down. And so never let the crisis go to waste. So we're going to pivot to 2020. But before we get there, Matthew Simmons wrote a book, and I remember it was my first introduction to Saudi fields, the whole concept. Twilight in the Desert was what it was called. It was given to every employee at Anadarko by Jim Hackett, who was my favorite CEO, notwithstanding what happened with Alta Mesa. He's a great spiritual, great leader. I mean, he was unbelievable to work for. I always loved him. But he gave it. Matthew Simmons talked to us. I read it, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, oil's going through the roof. That really set, I would say until your book, that really set the way the world viewed Saudi Arabia's oil fields. And it was like, they're all on water flood. They're all going to water out. Like, we're going to have this massive issue. We need to push American oil. And then we found the Bakken. Give me your feedback on the Matthew Simmons view, book, etc.
Yeah. So I read it. It was one of the books that I read. Excuse me. I think I read it even before I started to write Saudi Inc. One of the interesting things, so my background is in academia. I'm a historian, and the whole first part of the book is actually comes directly from my dissertation research. And my dissertation was a lot more focused on the
never let a good dissertation go to waste. I mean, if you can put it in a book, you got 150 pages in there.
Well, it's interesting because I don't let a good character go to waste. I couldn't let C. Stripling Snodgrass go. He was just too strange and bizarre of a person that I discovered. But anyway, so the dissertation was much more academic, obviously, but that's really where like the genesis of the book comes. And one of the things that I realized while writing it was that the Americans kept underestimating the Saudis constantly. They were always underestimating them. They thought that they didn't know what they were doing, that they were like, bums in the desert or things like that. And they were at a serious disadvantage, especially in the 1940s and the 1950s. But the Saudis knew what advantages they had, and they used them very well. And they were always extremely good at negotiation. And I think that but that mindset that like of underestimating them, of that the Saudis don't know what they're doing, I think that persisted into Simmons's book. And, he makes a very strong and convincing argument, and I can understand why a lot of people believed it. It also, I think personally, I think his book helped this idea of peak oil, not what we talk about today's peak oil. That's peak oil demand. I'm talking about like the King Hubbard curve, the peak oil supply, and so he played into that. And I wouldn't be surprised if his book actually helped push up oil prices even more, because it helped create this idea that like, well, Saudi Arabia is running out of oil, then everyone else is too, and so I think that perpetuated this and actually helped inflate the price of oil. But it's interesting. So Ali Al-Naimi, who I have had the occasion to meet and speak with, and but he wrote in his memoirs, he wrote about Simmons's book. He actually wrote about it, and that they disagreed with him, that they felt that he didn't have all of the information. And I think there was also this idea that because Aramco was so secretive and they didn't ever share any information about anything, that therefore they must be hiding something. And I think that's not taking into view, say you were working for Aramco. Okay, Aramco, you have to understand, is basically, at least especially at that time, basically like an American company that happens to be run by guys who have Saudi passports. I mean, these guys are all trained in America, okay, speak English perfectly. The company is run in English. You go there, you're like, it looks like you're in a California suburb. I mean, they pride themselves on basically saying our management structure is like Exxon. And so I think people didn't understand that, and they didn't have this idea that, okay, they're a private company. They basically have free reign within Saudi Arabia as long as they supply the country with all the oil and electricity and gas that it wants. They do whatever they want. Like their company, they run their company how they want. Why would they ever share any information with anybody? So if you've got to think about it from their perspectives, they're like, why should we care that people think we're running out of oil? We know we're not running out of oil. Why would we bother proving it to them when all they're doing is just jacking up the price more for us? So if you think about it, you have to like think about it from their perspective. They're not stupid. So I think that they didn't engage, and they have never shared any information more than they think is absolutely necessary. And so, but I think that people saw that um, as a tacit admission that it was this way, as opposed to the Saudis, where they're sitting there. They're basically sitting there ensconced in this like great, amazing place, and they're like looking down, like, why bother? Why should we bother with this? We know we're going to keep raking in the money. All we have to do is make sure we make enough money for the king, and that's that, and keep doing our thing.
Well, and that's why I think that the book is so important, is for people who work in industry. And I don't want to use criticize because I think it's maybe too heavy a phrase, but I think that people in our industry who get in conversations with their peers who can't explain, like a friend of mine yesterday texted me and he said it was some article in like Popular Mechanic that said solar panels are now cheaper than all forms of energy. And I went off on like a nine. And it turns out he was baiting me, but I went off on like a 19-line, like hear this. If you're using solar, you have to have backup, and you don't have the battery, so you need the natural gas, and they never include that cost. And then da, 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 da. And so, but the book is so interesting because it lays out the whole historical context, which leads to their IPO in 2019 and December. And they'd been thinking about it. They wanted to have the world's biggest valuation. That even though they have been notoriously private, they had to disclose to meet guidance, to disclose what their numbers were. And so when I started looking at them, having the Matthew Simmons, everything's a trouble problem, they're going to run out, and DeGalia McNaughton, and people can debate reserve audits versus not, but they go in, they do a pretty thorough job. It's $1 trillion company, and they show that they have a 53-year reserve life index of oil producing at 10 million barrels a day. Now, obviously, this is the lifeblood, and people talk about the societal cost. And your book does a really good job about talking about scholarships and sending Saudis to America and thinking about how they revitalize the economy. And then, at least as I interpret it, it's they take the oil revenue and try and turn it into something that, like, get the flywheel going. And I'm curious how you think the Saudis, given COVID, given global demand, given the change of the green policies, how did they view their 53-year reserve life index at 10 million barrels a day vis-a-vis peak oil demand?
I think that the Saudis are very skeptical of these peak oil demand estimations. That they look at BP and they're looking at BP's their world oil outlook, and they're saying BP is saying this because this is what the government and the company has to say,
and what Europe wants to hear.
And what Europe wants to hear. And the Saudis are sitting there thinking that yes, demand, there may be some limitations to demand, but they are looking, first of all, they're looking primarily at Europe. The Saudis are looking primarily at Asia. That's where they ship most of their crude oil. And they're seeing, first of all, I think there's the Naimi outlook is still very strong. And Naimi writes about how he's the one who really turned the company from we produce oil in Saudi Arabia to we are a global energy company. And he went to China in like the early 90s. And he went to China, he got off the airport, and there was a road. He describes there's a road, like a single lane road going to the airport. And most people were on bicycles. And he said, who is going to buy our oil in China? These people are all riding bicycles. And that's when he's like, we want to sell to China, but we need to put this on hold. We're going to sell to like South Korea instead. And so their first deal in Asia was in South Korea, not China. But I think they're still looking at it. They're still looking at it. They're like, okay, when is how these are developing nations who are coming out of poverty. So they're looking to India and they're saying, we see oil demand rising in India. Next thing they're going to be doing is looking at Africa. So I think they're still seeing that there's a lot of global development yet to happen, and that the alternatives to fossil fuels are still too expensive for these people. And I know, everyone's like, solar panels are so cheap. Well, great. What are you going to do with a order your solar panel in the mail, and what are you going to do with it? It's not going to run your car. It's not going to, get you to the supermarket. And so I think they also see a lot of huge markets for products and plastics. And so this is where they're going. And yet at the same time, they do see that this is finite. These are, I have a lot of skepticism when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman, but if we're kind of taking him more out of the picture and we're looking at kind of the whole of the Saudi monarchs, they have always looked at the big picture. And even, Mohammed bin Salman, if he becomes king, he could be king in those 50 years.
Yeah, because he's in his 30s, if I remember.
Yeah.
MBS, yeah?
Yeah, he's young.
He's young.
And unless he dies of a heart attack. I mean, these guys are notoriously long-lived. So
right. The no booze and the relatively healthy diet. I mean,
let's say it's officially no booze.
Officially,
we all know that King Fahd King Fahd had a stroke actually, and so he was officially king for 10 years. That he was totally incapacitated, but he lived a large lifestyle, at least before he officially became king. The brother that took over for him, Abdullah, was much more on the straight and narrow. So, and same with King Faisal. When you were talking about those two brothers, you're talking about King Saud and King Faisal. King Saud was gluttonous, wanted everything. King Faisal was very austere, had a single bed and was super.
And you could totally visualize the characters in the way you wrote about them. And it was almost like this Aladdin-like cartoon where the big brother wanted the fun and didn't want to fight. And then the other guy was in the Federal Reserve and managing the money. I mean, it was great. It really was great. I really can't say enough about it.
Oh, I loved. That was one of the things that made it so much fun was the characters and having these people were real characters, and the dialogue that's in the book is actually real dialogue taken directly. They're all direct quotes taken from documents where I think they used to write a lot more in the State Department in those days, where they would actually write and I said this such and such to him, and he said this and such back, and now they're just had conversation, decided this.
Well, we're on the subject of MBS, and I think I'd be remiss. I don't really want to talk about the Khashoggi thing because I think it just doesn't really get us anywhere. But my favorite MBS moment, if I had one, was when Donald Trump and he were sitting in the Oval Office. And Donald Trump was explaining the military equipment that we were buying. And he hands him the whiteboard thing with stickies from literally from your kid. And he's pointing to what they're buying.
He's you're spending all this money in our country. This and this and this. And MBS is kind of,
his face is the best. His face is the best. He's I know you're a billionaire and stuff, but I am more than this, and what are you doing? One of the greatest clips of all time.
Oh yeah, I thought that to me defined the relationship. To me, this is how I saw it. Saw it as he comes in, he thinks he comes in, he thinks he's in the Oval Office and everything, and he's gonna get do this, and this is huge for MBS. You have to understand that to the Saudis, the relationship with America is legitimacy. The Saudi monarchy thinks that the most important foreign policy move that America has ever made was when FDR met with Ibn Saud on the Great Bitter Lake during World War II. They think that is the pivotal moment in American foreign policy ever. That is the most important idea to them because it gives them so much legitimacy. If they knew that that event would never have even been recorded had it not been for this one guy who happened to write a tiny book about it, no one would ever know about it in America. So for MBS, coming to the Oval Office was a huge legitimacy thing. And Donald Trump is there. He's and you're spending all this money. And he's this, and you could see MBS is saying this is not going the way that I thought it was going to go. It was to me that was all Wow.
How many people have had meetings with Donald Trump and then like left and were like, that meeting did not go anything like I thought it was going to go?
Probably everyone.
But
Uh,
it's kind of the Donald Trump thing, and I was talking with someone about it yesterday. Is that like he's so sometimes and mostly unlikable by the things he does, and I think a lot of people hate him. But if you were in a room with him for like 30 minutes, I bet you would leave being like, he's actually like a pretty good guy. Like,
yeah.
and I don't know if people have spent time with like big athletes or big politicians, but like they are by their if you spend time with Kanye West is not super interested in hearing about what's going on in your life, and his aura is so impressive because of what he's done that you basically spend the whole time listening to him tell stories, kind of like when he was on Joe Rogan and didn't say anything for 3 hours. But if you were in that room with him, you're just like, wow. But it's so different when you become the leader of the free world, where now all of a sudden you're supposed to have like the most presidential moment I thought Trump had in his entire presidency was when he was doing it from the medical center. That tweet he sent out for like 4 minutes where he thanked everyone for the well wishes and he's feeling better and he's, staying on top of it. And like he had this sort of humility yet Donald Trumpness that was like, if he could have harnessed that for the last 4 years, there wouldn't be anywhere near the level. But the MBS moment was definitely the moment that was like, wow.
Yeah. And I think, I'm very skeptical with the way that MBS is dealing with Aramco, because I think that Aramco has always been this like incredible jewel, and it's done incredible things for Saudi Arabia. It's why Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia and not like Iran or Iraq, I think. I mean, not, like from a fiscal perspective,
Right.
in many senses. And because they let the oil men run things, and the oil men and these guys are, and like, okay, when the IPO perspective came out and everyone was like, Ahmed Nasser makes nothing. They were like, he's the CEO of the largest oil company in the world, and he like his salary is nothing like these other CEOs. And it was like people were stunned, and I was like, it's a different like mindset. I don't know how to explain it. I mean, it's not like he doesn't have a lot of perks. I mean, but it's and it's not like they don't make money other ways and things like that. I mean, some of them go on to become government ministers and such, but there's a sense that like they are stewards of this incredible gift,
right.
and that it's their responsibility to steward it with an eye towards like 50 years in the future. And so like when Aramco makes its large, plans for the future, it's planning for the really like long range. And I think that the way that this IPO was done has really hampered that. And in particular, like you can see it now in this period of low oil prices, that they are basically forced to be so committed to paying out this dividend and to funding the Saudi state, which also, by the way, takes not just the regular dividend, but gets extraordinary dividend, which is basically whatever they want, which ends up being around 60% of their budget. That's how it's ended up being. And so they're scaling back on all of these things that they had wanted to do. They wanted to do this crude to chemicals thing that's basically completely iced now.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I wonder if in 20, 30 years we'll look back on it, we'll see the effect of this. It's of both the IPO and the COVID punch happening like at the same time like this. Will it have harmed their long-term like ability to make money, because they've always spent a lot, but they also make a lot, and they make they've done that. They're incredibly blessed with this very low cost of production, but it's still, there's a lot of upkeep there. They've got, and we know, by the way, now everyone was questioning, well, can they really produce 12 million barrels a day? Oh yeah, they can produce 12 million barrels per day. And an interesting thing about that is despite putting other things on ice, they're going to go forward with increasing their maximum sustained capacity to 13. Right. And I think that's also a foreign policy thing, because that's their trump card. That's their ability. They can say, well, Russia, we can flood the oil market. That's their last ditch kind of power play.
So I have one more question about Saudi. Then I want to talk about Iran, and then we're gonna close it up. So the last question is: so when I read the IPO, similar to what you just said, at 10 million barrels a day, they have a 53-year reserve life. If they increase production, actual production to 13 million barrels a day, that's 30% above. The 53 drops to 38, roughly. Exxon is a 17-year reserve life index. And so if it was a pure capitalist American company, it would have the goal of tripling production because it would want to bring the reserve life down. When you overlay that with how Europe feels about crude, potentially we have to move to nuclear. Like, what is the window for oil that Saudi can meet all of its objectives if it were simply to triple oil production? And so I'm curious how you think about that, because when I saw, like, again, I was never in the camp that Saudi in 2014 was trying to crush the American shale industry, because at the time we didn't know what it was. Like, the Permian was barely started. Bakken and Eagle Ford were, quite frankly, irrelevant to Saudi. I think it was the U.S. government through the Clintons who wanted to sanction Russia because of their invasion in Crimea. They already had a whole bunch of economic sanctions, and that oil and gas was one of the huge exports of Russia that brought in currency. And so by crushing $100 oil, it was the way the Clintons and the Democrat administration could hamper Russia as part of the Crimean punishment, which then overlaid in 2016 when Hillary miraculously didn't become president and there was talk of the Russians meddling. So to me, I draw a line between it. And I also draw a line that the Russians have continued to push and fund anti-fracking and emotions and inertia in the U.S. because they produce 34% of the gas that goes to Europe. So if you crush America's 100 BCF a day by banning fracking, which does 67% of all natural gas in this country requires fracking, boom, all of a sudden there's this mass deficit and Russia gets $5, $6, $7 an MCF gas and they control the gas market. So I see them related.
Oh, I'm total. So in terms of the Russia, I think that see both. I think definitely Russia is without a doubt rooting for Biden because they would like to see America's oil and gas industry curbed. Anything. Oh, absolutely. This whole idea that they somehow want Trump seems to me ridiculous. And I've said that I think that Saudi Arabia should also want they should also want an administration in the U.S. that will put more restrictions on American oil production. Although people argue and they say, "Oh, that's not so important to Saudis." I think it actually is important to Saudis. I think the real reason that that the market crashed, from at the end of that OPEC made that decision in 2014. It wasn't really a decision. It was basically Naimi saying Saudi Arabia. So Naimi's experience in this, I think, was defined very much by this time when he was CEO of Aramco and during the 80s, and Hisham Nasr, Zaki Yamani, and then later Hisham Nasr, but mostly Zaki Yamani, who was the oil minister of Saudi Arabia. Yamani was a really, really good negotiator, but he was not very good at reading the oil market. And he had this idea that Saudi Arabia was going to play the swing producer for OPEC. And so OPEC would basically keep, other countries could all keep their quotas, and Saudi Arabia was going to swing low in order to get the oil price up. Well, what happened? Saudi Arabia got down to 2 million barrels a day of production. Aramco was suffering. They laid off a lot of people. They had to mothball their facilities until basically the Gulf War came around, and suddenly they were like, "Oh, could you please ramp up production a lot so that we can help the Americans defeat Saddam Hussein?" Right. And I think Naimi was very much like, his experience was very much defined by this idea that Saudi Arabia cannot be the swing producer when it comes to swinging low. He was happy to increase production when there wasn't, enough, but he did not want this because he saw what it did to the company. And he was also defined by this time when they tried to make a deal with Russia, and Russia said yes, and they went along with it, and then immediately Russia turned around and stabbed them in the back. So he had no trust for Russia at all. And in 2014, he saw production in the U.S. was rising, prices were starting to come down just a little bit, and there was so much pressure, but nobody wanted to cut. They all wanted Saudi to cut. And he's like, "We're not doing it." And I remember, this is really where the whole genesis of the book came out, was I remember being on an airplane. I was going to New York for Thanksgiving, and I was like, I was not like in a great place in my career per se, and I was trying to kind of think about like what maybe I wanted to do with myself next, and I remember watching like CNBC on the airplane, and they were talking about, and OPEC was meeting then. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and they were like, OPEC, refuses to commit to new quotas and prices are tanking. And I was like, and they're showing, Saudi Arabia. I'm like, wow. I'm like, you know why the Saudis did this? I was like, because they know that they're going to withstand this way better than anybody else because they're the lowest cost producer. I was like, this is a move, and they want to cause them pain. They're okay with low prices. Now the question, of course, is like, how long could Saudi last? And everyone was like, oh, they're going to give in, they're going to give in. And I kept saying, they're not going to give in yet. They're not going to give in yet. They've got, like $800 billion if foreign currency reserves. Like they can hold out for a while here. And I think that getting Russia in was a big deal. And I don't think, and definitely switching up the leadership and bringing in Khalid al-Falih, he was extremely proactive when it came to negotiating with Russia. I'm not sure that ABS is really as strong of a personality when it comes to that. And you could see, I think if Russia wasn't motivated right now to curb production, that they'd be in a difficult situation. I think that this whole Corona thing is basically it's basically put the Saudi-Russia, what will be a growing Saudi-Russia issue on hold for a little bit.
Right.
But it's coming.
March, well, and we talked about this on the panel, but March 6th was so important because the Russians said, everyone be themselves. And I'm on record. I was bullish oil because OPEC was constraining. There were sanctions on Iran. There were sanctions on all these places. And the U.S. was going to decline because we were running out of inventory. So all else being equal, that was going to be bullish for oil prices, which was good. Russia walking from the table and then Saudi responding the way they did. Now all these oil bulls that are talking about, oh yeah, OPEC's back together, to me is totally missing the point of what happened in March. And the second Saudi feels any level of threat, they're just going to crush whatever they want to do. Did you not find that in 2016, 3 weeks after Trump won the election was when the Saudis cut production? So we asked, how long did they last? They lasted that, and that's why I sort of go that the U.S. State Department had something to do with it, because they were applying pressure to Russia, who then wanted Hillary not to win, even though Trump was going to be a wild card. And then 3 weeks after the U.S. election was when they cut, and that was when prices started coming back.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if that was important to pushing Russia's position, because there was OPEC. I was at that meeting, and it was clear that had Russia not committed, OPEC would not have been able to agree. So they portray it as OPEC decided this, and then we called up our friend Russia, and we put together this big thing.
Yeah.
OPEC was deadlocked. They called up Russia. Russia was like, okay, we'll commit this. OPEC was like, okay, now that Russia has done it, I guess we'll all agree. But there would have been no agreement without Russia. If Russia had not, if Russia hadn't come in, there would not be even an OPEC agreement. OPEC would have collapsed.
So let's talk about Iran, and then we'll close. So the U.S. has had sanctions on Iran, and at least as I understand sanctions, the intent is to bring about change, at which point you will take the sanctions off because you have accomplished what you want. So for example, if you are fighting with your spouse, they say go sleep in the basement until your behavior changes, at which point you're then allowed not to sleep in the basement. Iran, we seem to be talking as though that 4 million barrels a day, which they produce 2 million, which is their internal need, and they smuggle, and we can talk about that. But it seems like we always forget that the goal of the sanctions, at least to me, is to incite regime change. It feels like we're very close to regime change, at which point Iran then re-enters the global world. That is a neophyte's, non-geopolitical expert's view of the situation. You are the expert, so I'm curious where you come on the Iran.
I think part of the problem is that we don't really know what the goal is. I think that there are definitely some people in the administration, or people who are not in the administration but backed sanctions, whose goal is regime change. That was the ultimate goal, is to pressure them so much economically that the Iranian people rise up and overthrow what is actually technically their democratically elected government with a constitution that they themselves voted for back in the 70s. So I think this is a lot. It's not, Iran is kind of people say it's a theocracy. It sort of is. It's sort of democratic. I actually teach a whole class about Iran, and my favorite thing is doing the Iranian civics lecture, because explaining, like, based on their constitution, how their government's actually supposed to work. Because if you think our government is convoluted, you know how that government, you draw the three branches and the triangle. Their government, it's like a trapezoid and like an overlay triangle. It's crazy, but it technically is a government that they established themselves. And so I think that, like, I think John Bolton wanted regime change. The administration, at least Pompeo, is always saying, until they behave like a normal country. Well, this is also nebulous. Do they mean stop sending their militias out to interfere in, like, the government of Iraq? Are they talking about that? Are they talking about terrorism? Are they talking about the nuclear stuff? Like, there aren't necessarily specific benchmarks. So I don't think that the Trump administration is trying to create regime change. I don't think they want to do regime change. I don't think that's something they want to do. I think if it happened to happen, they would support it. Although there's a big question of, like, who would be the new government. And I don't think that this MEK group, they're basically like Pahlavists who are kind of also crazy, and like a crazy cult, but also like from the Pahlavis. So that's not going to fly. No one thinks that they're going to go back to the Shah as a government.
Right.
So I mean, in some cases, I think that if President Trump wins re-election, I think his goal is to do a new deal. And that deal could look a lot like the JCPOA. I wouldn't be surprised if it looked kind of similar
The
to
JCP, which is
the
what?
JCPOA was the original Iran nuclear deal that
The one that Obama put
and
in place.
Yeah.
Okay. That he walked from in 2017, I think it was.
And I would and I don't think it was a particularly good deal to begin with. I haven't read the whole thing, but I read parts of it. It was a very, very long deal. So I think Trump's goal is to push them into a state where they realize that they need to renegotiate, and they need to do it with the U.S. And I don't think Trump cares about the EU and all that. He'll be like, EU, I think you should sign on to this, but I don't think he's going to do it in like a P5+1 state. That's not the same as that's a different objective from Iran, until Iran behaves like a normal nation, from regime change. I don't think sanctions work to create regime change. They can work in conjunction with other things, but we haven't seen them work to create regime change. If they haven't worked yet, the best thing they have is if Trump gets another. The Iranians were basically waiting it out to see if Trump gets booted out of office, and then they get someone who hates Trump's policy so much that they'll go full on reverse. That's what they're hoping for. If Trump wins, they're in a different situation, and I think they'll be much more open to negotiation. That being said, it's like I talked to someone actually about how these sanctions are administered, and it's like insane the way they have to go after these people. It's like, but they get a lot of money out of it. Like, the amount of money that they have actually ended up collecting from companies that have violated the sanctions is like, it's actually quite a bit of money.
They just sanctioned a tanker company about trying to export 1 million barrels or something. Like,
Yeah.
it is crazy. So tell people what you're doing. You are the smartest PhD I've ever talked to, because for a lot of reasons, but you articulate things so well, and your depth of knowledge and range and topic and the way you communicate. So what do you do now? How do people follow you? How do people connect with you? And what can we expect from you? Are you going to run for governor at some point?
Oh God, no. I could never do politics like that. I couldn't. I think politicians are awful. Anyway, so what do I do? Okay, so I have a consulting company, actually. It's called Transversal Consulting, and we do we're more like a boutique consulting firm. We do projects for various companies, ranging from oil services companies to other management consulting firms to PR firms. We do a lot of different things connected to oil and geopolitics. A lot of what you kind of noted, which is we do a lot in terms of helping people communicate. these ideas better. So sometimes people they'll have these, they want to explain this, or they want something well explained so that everybody can understand what they're talking about in terms of oil and geopolitics and energy markets. And so we're very good at producing material and explaining these things. I also give talks in person, although now mostly online, about energy market politics, geopolitics, kind of what to expect. We don't really do like, here's our target price of oil kind of thing. I don't believe that that's a very useful thing for me to do, but we'll talk about what are the various factors so that you or whatever business you're in can help make a more educated decision about where things are going. So you can find us at transversalconsulting.com. You can find me particularly. I'm very active on the Twitter, in the Twitter universe. So you can definitely follow me there. I write in a variety of different places. I write a weekly column about kind of more focused on trading and oil prices for investing.com. I also write for Forbes about slightly less technical issues. And then I also sometimes write on Bloomberg. If you're interested in hearing more about the Aramco IPO, I suggest you check out some of my op-eds in the New York Times, because I wrote a couple op-eds about the IPO there. On Twitter, you can follow me at Energized Economy, and that's ENERGZD Economy, and definitely give me a shout out on Twitter if you heard me on the podcast.
Well, you are a rock star. I am a fanboy, but my favorite thing about hosting a podcast, and I always say that I wish I had hosted it earlier, because you become such a better listener. Now, I might not be the greatest listener of all time, but I promise you I'm better than I used to be. And I get to talk to really, really smart people like yourself. So my advice to myself, if I could go back 20 years ago, would be start a podcast, learn to listen better. It'll make you a better leader. If you could go back to your 20 year ago self and give yourself some advice, what would you tell yourself?
Oh, gosh. Don't waste your time on the academic job market, because it's not going to happen.
I love it. I love it. So become a PhD and then use it in the private market.
Yeah. And I'd also say that, like, I'm glad I got my PhD, mostly because I never would have gotten into the things that I've gotten into since then. I never would have discovered how interesting oil is. But a PhD is really not all that useful in the private sector. It's just not. And, I did enjoy the experience, and I love teaching, and I love that I can teach college students but
do you teach now? Do you teach now?
I'm not currently teaching, but I have in the past taught like one or two classes at a local university. I'm not at the moment, but it was really like eye-opening. I hit the job market at the absolute worst possible time, when there were absolutely no jobs. And I think I would have told myself, I would have said, like, get the PhD or like go to business school or something at the end, and look elsewhere, because it was a demoralizing experience. And there's so much else out there in the world that's interesting, and interesting things and people to talk to. And I love this world so much more than the academic world that I was in.
Well, I think you're a rock star. For everyone, for all the listeners, honestly, this is a really, really exceptional book. Saudi Inc. is the name. Ellen Wald is the author. Thank you so much for joining us on the Hot Take of the Day podcast. I look forward to staying in touch with you, and I always really respect and appreciate what you're doing.
And you can get the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold.
Yes.
And there's audiobook too, for those who like that.
Do you read it?
No, I do not read it. A guy with a British accent does. It was not Patrick Stewart, which was very sad, because I really thought he would be the best.
I've had a lot of people ask me to read What the F is Wrong with Everybody Else, What They Didn't Teach You in Business School, which is my book, because everyone says I write exactly like I talk. And so if they've ever met me once, they can hear me talking the entire book. So they're like, you should just read it. I haven't done it yet, but I might.
You should. You have the voice for it.
Well, I appreciate it. I've had a lot of fun with this. So, Ellen, thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day.